The cruelest thing a billionaire wrote that night wasn't on a contract, wasn't in an email, and wasn't worth a single dollar. It was one sentence on a restaurant receipt, and before the sun came up, he would wish he could take it back. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows of the Alder Room, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, where crystal glasses caught the glow of golden chandeliers and conversations about mergers, acquisitions, and private jets floated through the air like background music. Most people came there to celebrate success. Others came there to display it. Claire Bennett came there to work. At 28 years old, she moved between tables with quiet confidence, balancing trays with practiced ease while offering the same warm smile to every guest, whether they ordered a $12 soup or a $500 bottle of wine. She wasn't the loudest server in the restaurant. She wasn't the one who flirted for bigger tips or fought for attention. Most guests barely remembered her face after they left. But the people who worked beside her noticed things. They noticed how she stayed late to help new employees, how she remembered birthdays, how she always seemed calm, even during the busiest Friday night rush. They noticed the old silver watch she wore every shift, a watch that looked out of place among designer suits and luxury handbags. No one knew much about her life outside the restaurant. Claire preferred it that way. That evening had started like any other. The dinner crowd filled every table. Glasses clinked. Soft jazz drifted from hidden speakers. Outside, a steady spring rain washed the city streets below. Inside, Claire checked the seating chart and noticed a familiar name highlighted in gold. Ethan Caldwell. Even among Manhattan's elite, the name carried weight. Billionaire. Founder. Investor. Magazine cover regular. The kind of man who could move markets with a single interview. The kind of man people stood a little straighter around. By 8:30, Ethan arrived. The room reacted before he even reached his table. Conversations paused. Heads turned. A manager hurried forward with an eager smile. Ethan acknowledged everyone with a brief nod before taking his seat near the windows overlooking Fifth Avenue. He looked tired, not physically exhausted, but emotionally drained. The expression of someone carrying frustrations he couldn't leave at the office. His expensive charcoal suit fit perfectly. His watch probably cost more than a new car. Yet there was no satisfaction in his face. Only irritation. Claire approached with menus and water. "Good evening, Mr. Caldwell. My name is Claire. I'll be taking care of you tonight." Ethan barely looked up from his phone. "Water, black coffee, and give me a few minutes." Claire smiled politely. "Of course." She walked away. The interaction lasted less than 10 seconds. Still, something about the way Ethan dismissed her lingered in the air. Not rude enough to draw attention. Not kind enough to be forgotten. As the night continued, Claire returned several times. Refilling coffee, delivering dinner, checking quietly if he needed anything else. Each time, Ethan responded with short answers and distracted glances toward his phone. Whatever storm he carried into the restaurant seemed to be growing heavier with every passing minute. And neither of them knew that before sunrise, their lives would cross again in a way neither could have imagined. Claire rarely talked about the watch. Most people assumed it was inexpensive because it was old. The leather strap had faded over the years. Tiny scratches covered the silver case. It looked ordinary, forgotten, easy to overlook, much like Claire herself. During a short break between tables, she glanced down at it while standing near the service station. 10:43, almost the end of her shift. She brushed her thumb gently across the worn edge of the watch before slipping her hand back to her side. The gesture lasted less than a second. No one noticed. Yet it was a ritual she had repeated almost every day for nearly 7 years. The watch had belonged to her father, long before Manhattan, long before restaurant uniforms and late-night subway rides, long before life became a series of practical decisions and sacrifices nobody saw. Her father used to say that time revealed character. Not money, not titles, not appearances. Time. Give people enough time, and they eventually show you who they really are. Claire remembered those words often, especially on difficult nights, especially when customers treated service workers as if they were invisible. The dinner rush continued around her. Orders arrived. Plates disappeared. Conversations flowed. Across the dining room, Ethan Caldwell remained alone at his table near the window. His untouched coffee had gone cold nearly 20 minutes earlier. Claire noticed because she noticed everything. She noticed when elderly guests struggled to read menus. She noticed when couples were celebrating anniversaries. She noticed when someone needed help before they asked for it. And she noticed that Ethan had checked his phone 16 times in the last 10 minutes. Not that she was counting. It was simply hard to miss. The screen would light up. He would glance down. His jaw would tighten slightly. Then he would place the phone back on the table. Whatever message he was waiting for never seemed to arrive. Outside, the rain grew heavier. Headlights reflected across wet pavement like rivers of gold. The city looked beautiful from 20 stories above the street. Most nights, Claire enjoyed that view. Tonight felt different. There was tension in the air she could not explain. Around 11 o'clock, her manager approached. "Claire, table 12 asked specifically for you." She smiled. "I will be right there." Another hour passed. The crowd slowly thinned. Business executives paid their checks. Tourists disappeared into waiting cars. Staff members began quietly preparing for closing time. Ethan was one of the few guests still seated. When Claire returned to refresh his water, she noticed a document displayed on his tablet. Rows of financial projections filled the screen. Numbers, charts, risk assessments. His eyes remained fixed on them. "Can I bring you anything else this evening, Mr. Caldwell?" she asked politely. Ethan looked up for the first time in several minutes. His expression softened slightly, though only for a moment. "No, thank you." It was a simple answer, yet it carried less impatience than before. Claire nodded and continued working. Across the room, Ethan watched her leave. Something about her seemed unusual. Not dramatic, not obvious, just different. Most people in New York either wanted something from him or wanted to impress him. Claire appeared interested in neither. She simply did her job with quiet professionalism and moved on. For reasons he could not explain, that bothered him almost as much as it intrigued him. Meanwhile, Claire returned to the service station and collected a stack of menus. Her shift would end soon. She was already thinking about the subway ride home, the small apartment in Queens, and the call she planned to make before going to bed. She had no idea that within a few hours, a single piece of paper would connect her future to the most powerful man in the restaurant. And she certainly had no idea that the old watch on her wrist was counting down to a night neither of them would ever forget. By 11:30, the Alder room had entered that strange final hour when luxury felt quieter. The chandeliers still glowed. The silverware still sparkled. Yet the energy had changed. The excitement of the evening was fading, replaced by the exhaustion of a long day. Claire carried a tray of empty glasses toward the kitchen while the remaining staff began preparing for closing. Outside, rain streamed down the windows in long silver lines. Across the city, thousands of lights shimmered through the darkness. Ethan Caldwell remained seated alone. His dinner was finished. His coffee sat untouched. His attention was fixed on a conversation happening somewhere far beyond the restaurant walls. At exactly 11:37, his phone vibrated. This time he answered immediately. Claire happened to be passing nearby when she noticed the subtle change in his posture. His shoulders stiffened. The muscles in his jaw tightened. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. When it ended, Ethan remained motionless. He stared at the dark screen for several seconds before setting the phone down. Whatever news he had received was not good. Not even close. Ethan leaned back and looked out at the rain-covered skyline. For most people, a bad day meant a delayed flight or a missed opportunity. For Ethan, a bad day could affect thousands of employees and hundreds of millions of dollars. Earlier that afternoon, one of his largest investment partnerships had begun showing signs of trouble. A deal he had spent nearly 8 months building was suddenly hanging by a thread. Investors were nervous. Advisors were divided. Competitors were waiting for him to fail. The pressure had followed him into the restaurant. It sat beside him at the table. It followed every sip of coffee, every glance at his phone, every silent moment staring through the glass into the night. Years ago, Ethan had dreamed of becoming successful. He imagined freedom, security, respect. What he had not imagined was the constant weight of responsibility, the endless expectations, the feeling that one wrong decision could undo years of work. Success had given him everything except peace. A waiter from another section accidentally brushed against his chair while passing. "Sorry, sir," the young man said quickly. Ethan barely acknowledged him. "It is fine," but his tone carried enough frustration to make the employee hurry away. Claire noticed, not because Ethan was unusually rude. In fact, compared to some wealthy customers, he was relatively polite. The problem was different. Ethan had stopped seeing people. Not intentionally, not maliciously, simply gradually. The staff had become part of the background. Like furniture, like music, like lighting. Necessary, invisible. Claire had seen it before. The higher some people climbed, the less they noticed those standing right beside them. Near midnight, she delivered the final dessert order of the evening to another table. When she returned, Ethan was signing documents on his tablet while reviewing financial reports. The glow from the screen reflected across his face. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a man desperately trying to hold something together. Claire paused briefly beside his table. "Would you like a fresh coffee before we close the kitchen?" she asked. Ethan looked up. For a moment, his expression softened. "No, thank you." Then his phone vibrated again. The softness disappeared instantly. Claire walked away without another word. Neither of them realized they were approaching the exact moment when exhaustion, frustration, and misplaced anger would collide. And when they did, a single decision would begin changing both of their lives before the night was over. Midnight arrived quietly. The last few guests settled their checks. Chairs were being straightened in empty sections. Glasses disappeared into the kitchen. Outside, the rain showed no signs of stopping. Manhattan shimmered beneath dark clouds and endless reflections. Claire glanced at her watch. 12 o'clock exactly. Another 30 minutes and her shift would finally be over. She gathered a stack of receipts from nearby tables and began organizing them at the service station. Across the dining room, Ethan remained the final customer. Most restaurant employees secretly dreaded being assigned the last table of the night. Not because the work was difficult, but because one table often delayed everyone else's chance to go home. Yet Claire showed no frustration. When Ethan requested another glass of water, she brought it immediately. When he asked for fresh coffee after declining it earlier, she quietly replaced the cold cup without mentioning the change. Her professionalism never wavered. Ethan noticed. He simply chose not to think about it. His attention remained trapped inside a crisis unfolding through phone calls, messages, and financial reports. Every update seemed worse than the one before. At 12:10, his chief financial officer called again. Ethan stood and walked toward a quieter corner near the windows. The conversation lasted almost 10 minutes. Claire passed nearby twice during that time. She never tried to listen, never stared, never interrupted. Still, she could see enough to recognize the signs of a person under immense pressure. The pacing, the clenched jaw, the exhausted eyes, the silence after difficult news. When the call finally ended, Ethan returned to his table looking older than he had an hour earlier. Claire approached with the check presenter tucked neatly beneath her arm. "Whenever you are ready, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan nodded without looking up. "Thank you." His voice sounded distant, almost mechanical. Claire placed the check beside him and moved away. For a few minutes, the restaurant fell into a peaceful rhythm. Staff cleaned quietly. The dishwasher hummed in the background. Rain tapped against the windows. Then another message arrived on Ethan's phone. This one changed everything. His eyes scanned the screen. Once, twice. A major investor was pulling out. Effective immediately. Months of negotiations were suddenly collapsing. Millions of dollars in projected revenue vanished in a single notification. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He felt exhausted, angry, disappointed. Not at Claire, not at the restaurant, not even at the investor. Angry at himself, angry at the situation, angry at a world that seemed determined to test him from every direction at once. Unfortunately, frustration often looks for the nearest exit, and the nearest exit happened to be a piece of paper resting on the table. A few minutes later, Claire returned to collect the payment. Ethan had already left his card inside the presenter. "I will process this right away," she said politely. He barely responded. Claire walked to the register and completed the transaction. Nothing unusual, nothing memorable, just another check among hundreds she had handled that year. She returned with the receipt and placed it neatly in front of Ethan. "Thank you for dining with us tonight. I hope you have a safe trip home in the rain." Ethan stared at the paper. Then he picked up a pen. For several seconds, he simply looked down at the receipt. The restaurant lights reflected across the polished table. The rain continued outside. Somewhere in that moment, exhaustion overpowered judgment. Frustration overpowered kindness. And a decision that seemed insignificant at the time began taking shape beneath the tip of his pen. Claire smiled politely before stepping away to help finish closing duties. She had no reason to think anything unusual was about to happen. But on the table behind her, Ethan lowered the pen and began writing. The pen moved slowly across the receipt. Ethan stared at the blank space beneath the total as if the paper had somehow become the target for every frustration he had carried into the restaurant that night. The investor withdrawal, the collapsing partnership, the endless pressure, the disappointment. None of it had anything to do with Claire Bennett. Yet in that moment, reason gave way to irritation. By the time he finished writing, the damage was already done. He left a standard tip. The amount was fair, generous, even. Then beneath it, he added a sentence. Maybe if you spent less time daydreaming and more time working, you would deserve a real career. Ethan looked at the words for a second. Somewhere deep inside, a quieter voice suggested crossing them out, tearing up the receipt, walking away. But exhaustion won the argument. He slipped the paper into the check presenter, stood from the table, buttoned his jacket, and headed toward the exit. No dramatic scene followed. No confrontation. No raised voices. The front door opened. Cool rain-scented air drifted inside. Then Ethan Caldwell disappeared into the Manhattan night. 10 minutes later, the restaurant officially closed. Staff members finished their final tasks. Chairs were stacked. Lights dimmed. Music stopped. Claire carried the last group of receipts toward the register. She worked methodically, organizing paperwork while exchanging tired smiles with co-workers eager to go home. The receipt from table 21 was almost the last one she opened. She glanced at the tip first. Then her eyes moved lower. The sentence waited there. Simple, sharp, unexpected. For a moment she just stared. Not because the words were particularly creative. She had heard worse from customers over the years. What surprised her was the assumption hidden inside them. The certainty that a person could be measured by a job title. The belief that serving tables somehow meant a life lacked ambition or value. Claire felt her fingers tighten slightly around the paper. Then she exhaled. Slowly, calmly, the same way her father had taught her years ago. She read the sentence once more before folding the receipt neatly in half. No tears, no anger, no dramatic reaction, just quiet disappointment. Her coworker Melissa approached while putting on her coat. Everything okay? Claire smiled. The same gentle smile she gave everyone. Yes, just a long night. Melissa nodded. Tell me about it. A few minutes later, Claire slipped the folded receipt into her purse beside her father's watch case and gathered her belongings. Outside, the rain had softened into a mist. The streets glowed beneath streetlights and reflections. Taxis drifted through the darkness. The city seemed quieter than usual. Claire stepped onto the sidewalk and pulled her coat tighter against the cool air. She could have thrown the receipt away. Most people would have. Instead, she kept it. Not because the words mattered. Because they revealed something. Time reveals character. Her father's voice echoed softly in memory. Give people enough time, and they eventually show you who they are. Several miles away, Ethan sat alone in the back seat of a Blacktown car, staring at financial reports while the city rolled past his window. He never thought about the receipt again. Not that night. Not during the next phone call. Not while reviewing emergency projections. He believed the moment was over. Forgotten. Insignificant. He had no idea that before sunrise, the same piece of paper would become the most important receipt he had ever signed. Claire's apartment sat on the 4th floor of a modest brick building in Queens. It was small, quiet, comfortable enough. By the time she arrived home, the city had settled into that strange hour when even New York seemed to breathe more slowly. She placed her purse on the kitchen counter and removed the folded receipt. For a moment, she looked at it again beneath the soft glow of a single lamp. The words had not changed. They were still there, still unnecessary, still revealing. Yet Claire felt no desire to argue with them. She simply folded the paper once more and slipped it into a drawer beside old photographs and letters she rarely opened. Then she sat near the window with a cup of tea and stared out at the rain. Across town, Ethan's night was becoming considerably worse. The emergency conference call that began shortly after midnight was still going strong. Advisors joined from Chicago, Boston, San Francisco, and London. Financial projections covered multiple screens inside his penthouse office. Every scenario seemed to end the same way. Losses, delays, uncertainty. At 1:30 in the morning, another update arrived. The investment group pulling out had influenced 2 additional partners. The problem was spreading. Ethan rubbed his eyes and loosened his tie. He felt exhausted. More exhausted than he had felt in years. One of his senior executives spoke carefully through a video call. There may be one possibility left. Ethan looked up immediately. What possibility? The executive hesitated. The Harrison Group. The room fell quiet. Ethan knew the name. Everyone in corporate finance knew the name. Harrison Group specialized in rescuing troubled negotiations. When billion-dollar deals began collapsing, they were often the last call companies made before walking away. The problem was simple. Harrison Group was selective. Extremely selective. They rarely accepted emergency projects. And when they did, they chose their own lead strategist. Ethan leaned forward. Contact them. The executive nodded. Already done. And we should have an answer before morning. For the first time all night, Ethan felt a small sense of relief. It was not hope exactly, more like the possibility of hope. Meanwhile, Claire finished her tea and prepared for bed. Before turning off the lamp, she opened an email on her laptop. The subject line contained the name Harrison Group. Several unread messages waited inside the thread. Claire reviewed tomorrow's schedule one final time. A private strategy meeting. 6:30 in the morning. Midtown Manhattan. Mandatory attendance. She closed the laptop and smiled faintly. Tomorrow would be important. Very important. Yet even she did not know which client she would be meeting. The project details had been restricted. Confidential. Urgent. High priority. Outside, the rain finally began to fade. Clouds drifted slowly across the sleeping city. In his penthouse office, Ethan remained surrounded by screens and projections. In her small apartment, Claire slept peacefully beside the old watch that once belonged to her father. Neither of them realized they were moving toward the same sunrise. And neither of them realized that before the morning was over, one folded receipt would connect two worlds that had never been meant to collide. At 4:15 in the morning, the city was caught between night and day. The streets were quieter. The traffic had thinned. Even the skyline seemed softer beneath the fading clouds. Ethan Caldwell stood alone beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the first hints of dawn approach from somewhere beyond the Hudson River. He had not slept. Not for a single minute. Empty coffee cups lined the conference table behind him. Financial reports covered every available surface. His executive team looked exhausted. Yet the answers they needed remained frustratingly out of reach. At 4:22, his phone rang. Every conversation in the room stopped instantly. Ethan answered before the second ring. This is Caldwell. The voice on the other end belonged to a senior partner from Harrison Group. Calm. Professional. Direct. Mr. Caldwell, we reviewed the situation overnight. Ethan straightened, and a brief pause followed. We are willing to take the project. Relief swept across the room. Several executives exchanged hopeful looks. For the first time in hours, someone actually smiled. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Thank you. But the partner was not finished. However, there is one condition. The relief immediately faded. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. What condition? The project lead has already been assigned. Ethan frowned. Assigned by whom? By us. Another pause. If you want Harrison Group involved, the strategist we selected will have full authority over negotiations. Ethan glanced around the room. Normally, he disliked surrendering control, especially during a crisis. But he had few options left. Who is the strategist? The partner answered calmly. Someone with an exceptional track record. Ethan waited. Her name is Claire Bennett. Silence filled the office. Ethan searched his memory. The name meant nothing to him. No famous consultant. No television personality. No best-selling business author. Just a name. I'm not familiar with her, Ethan admitted. You will be, the partner replied. She will meet your team at 6:30 this morning. The call ended moments later. Across the conference room, executives immediately began searching databases and professional profiles. Yet surprisingly little information appeared. No interviews. No public appearances. Very few photographs. The more they searched, the more curious the situation became. Meanwhile, several miles away, Claire Bennett was already awake. Soft morning light filtered through her apartment window as she prepared for the day ahead. Unlike Ethan, she looked rested, calm, focused. She poured herself a cup of coffee and reviewed a small notebook filled with handwritten observations. No panic, no stress, just preparation. Her father's watch rested beside the notebook. 5:12 in the morning. Claire closed the notebook and slipped it into her bag. Then she opened the same drawer where she had placed the folded receipt only a few hours earlier. For a moment she looked at it. The paper remained exactly where she left it. She considered throwing it away. Instead, she placed it inside her portfolio. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, simply because it reminded her of something important. Assumptions reveal more about the person making them than the person receiving them. Outside, the first sunlight finally touched the city skyline. The storm had passed. The streets glistened beneath fresh morning light. Ethan Caldwell gathered his executives and headed toward the conference center where his company's future might be decided. Claire Bennett stepped into a waiting car carrying nothing more than a portfolio, a notebook, and an old silver watch. Neither of them knew exactly what would happen when they met again. But fate had already arranged the meeting. And in less than 90 minutes, Ethan was about to discover that the quiet waitress he had forgotten was someone he should never have underestimated. The conference center occupied the top floors of a glass tower overlooking Midtown Manhattan. By 6:20 in the morning, executives, attorneys, analysts, and investors were already gathering inside a private boardroom reserved for crisis negotiations. The atmosphere felt heavy. Not loud, not chaotic, just tense. Everyone understood what was at stake. Ethan Caldwell arrived first. He looked composed on the outside, but fatigue lingered beneath his eyes. His team followed closely behind, carrying tablets, reports, and projections prepared throughout the night. Nobody talked about failure, yet everyone could feel it standing quietly in the corner of the room. 6:25. Then 6:28. The lead strategist from Harrison Group had still not arrived. Ethan glanced toward the door. "Are we certain she is coming?" he asked. One of the executives nodded. "That is what Harrison Group confirmed." Ethan sat back and folded his arms. Around him, conversations remained cautious. The mystery surrounding Claire Bennett only seemed to grow. No one had been able to uncover much information. No media appearances. No professional interviews. No public profile explaining why Harrison Group trusted her with projects worth billions. At exactly 6:30, the boardroom door opened. Several people looked up casually, then froze. Claire Bennett stepped inside carrying a leather portfolio and a simple notebook. The room went silent. Ethan stared. For one brief moment, he genuinely believed he was imagining things. The waitress from the Alder room stood in front of the entire executive team. The same calm blue eyes, the same composed expression, the same quiet confidence. Even the old silver watch remained on her wrist. Nobody spoke. Claire looked around the room professionally before offering a polite smile. "Good morning, everyone." The silence deepened. Ethan's chief financial officer blinked twice. One attorney nearly dropped a tablet. Ethan remained completely motionless. Claire set her portfolio on the conference table. "I apologize if traffic caused concern. Shall we begin?" Several executives exchanged confused looks. Finally, Ethan found his voice. "Claire Bennett." She looked toward him calmly. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell." There was no hint of sarcasm, no visible anger, no reference to the previous night, just professional courtesy. Ethan stared for another second. "You are the lead strategist?" "I am." Again, no drama, no explanation, simply a statement of fact. Claire opened her portfolio and distributed several documents across the table. Within seconds, attention shifted away from surprise and toward the material itself. Detailed risk assessments, alternative financing structures, investor recovery strategies, contingency projections. The work was extraordinary, precise, elegant, thorough. Ethan picked up one report and quickly realized he was looking at analysis completed in only a few hours that rivaled projects his company normally spent weeks developing. Around the room, executives began turning pages faster. Questions emerged. Then more questions. Claire answered every one of them. Calmly, clearly, effortlessly. As the meeting progressed, the atmosphere transformed. Anxiety slowly gave way to focus. Possibilities emerged where none had existed before. Solutions appeared where everyone else had only seen problems. Ethan listened carefully, unable to reconcile the woman leading the room with the waitress he had dismissed only hours earlier. Then his eyes drifted toward the portfolio beside her notebook. A folded piece of paper rested partially visible inside. The shape looked familiar, uncomfortably familiar, and for the first time since entering the room, Ethan felt something far worse than stress. He felt shame. For the next hour, The boardroom moved at a completely different pace. The panic that had dominated the night slowly disappeared beneath Claire Bennett's leadership. She stood near the center of the room, guiding discussions with calm precision while executives scribbled notes and revised projections. Nobody questioned her authority anymore. Not after seeing the quality of her work. Not after watching her identify weaknesses that entire departments had overlooked. Claire never raised her voice. She never demanded attention. Somehow, she did not need to. Every time she spoke, the room listened. Ethan remained unusually quiet. Part of him focused on the business crisis. Another part remained trapped in a completely different realization. Less than 8 hours earlier, he had assumed he understood exactly who Claire Bennett was. A waitress, a service worker, someone passing through life one shift at a time. Now she was rebuilding a deal that experts across multiple cities had nearly abandoned. The contrast was impossible to ignore. At 7:45, Claire projected a revised strategy onto the large conference screen. Charts appeared. Timelines shifted. Financial pathways emerged where none had existed before. The original structure created unnecessary pressure points, she explained. The investors did not lose confidence in the numbers. They lost confidence in the communication. Several executives exchanged surprised looks. Claire continued. The data was strong. The message was weak. Ethan studied the presentation carefully. She was right. Painfully right. Weeks of negotiations had focused on financial performance while ignoring concerns about long-term stability. It was a mistake no one had fully recognized until now. If we reposition the proposal around sustainability instead of speed, Claire said, 2 of the withdrawn partners are likely to return. One executive leaned forward. You believe that strongly? Claire nodded. I do not believe it. I know it. The certainty in her voice was not arrogance. It was expertise. There was a difference. The meeting continued. Solutions multiplied. Confidence slowly returned. For the first time since the crisis began, people started discussing recovery instead of damage control. Then came the moment Ethan had been quietly dreading. During a short break, most of the executives stepped into the hallway. Coffee was delivered. Phones reappeared. Conversations resumed in smaller groups. Claire remained at the conference table reviewing notes. Ethan looked around. They were finally alone. The folded receipt remained partially visible inside her portfolio. He could see it from where he stood. Claire noticed his glance, but said nothing. She simply continued reading. Ethan approached slowly. Claire. She looked up politely. Yes, Mr. Caldwell. There was no hostility in her voice. Somehow that made the situation worse. Ethan hesitated. For perhaps the first time in years, words failed him. He had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions. He had spoken before investors, reporters, and government officials. Yet this simple conversation felt remarkably difficult. Finally he spoke. I did not know. Claire closed her notebook gently. Did not know what? Ethan glanced toward the portfolio, toward the folded paper, toward the evidence of his own assumptions. Who you were. Claire studied him quietly. Then a faint smile appeared. Not triumphant. Not bitter. Just thoughtful. That is the interesting thing about assumptions, she said softly. They usually tell us more about ourselves than about the other person. Ethan lowered his eyes. And for the first time since sunrise, he understood that saving the deal might be easier than facing the lesson waiting for him on a folded receipt. The break ended, and the boardroom slowly filled once again. Executives returned carrying coffee cups and updated reports. Conversations resumed. Screens illuminated. The crisis was not over, but the atmosphere had changed. For the first time since the previous evening, people believed a solution might actually exist. Claire Bennett returned to the front of the room and continued guiding the discussion with the same calm confidence that had transformed the morning. Yet Ethan Caldwell found it increasingly difficult to focus on spreadsheets and projections. One question lingered in his mind. Who was she really? The answer arrived unexpectedly. During a discussion about investor confidence, one of the senior partners from Harrison Group joined the meeting remotely. His image appeared on the large screen at the end of the room. After reviewing several recommendations, he smiled toward Claire. As expected, he said. Excellent work. Claire acknowledged the compliment with a simple nod. The partner looked around the room. For those who have not worked with Claire before, you should know that many of our most successful recovery projects over the past 5 years were built on strategies she designed. Several executives exchanged surprised looks. The partner continued. Some of the largest mergers in the country were stabilized using frameworks she developed. Most clients never knew her name because she prefers it that way. Ethan leaned forward slightly. She prefers it that way? The partner smiled. Claire has never been interested in recognition. Someone else spoke up. Then why have so few people heard of her? The answer came from Claire herself. Because attention was never the goal. Her voice remained steady. Matter of fact. Nothing more. The room fell quiet. Ethan studied her carefully. He suddenly realized that while everyone else spent years building public reputations, Claire had spent those same years building results. No interviews. No headlines. No personal brand. Just work. Extraordinary work. The partner on the screen nodded. Several years ago, Claire could have accepted executive positions almost anywhere she wanted. Instead, she stepped away. Another executive frowned. Why? For the first time all morning, Claire hesitated. Only briefly. Then she answered. My mother became ill. The room remained silent. She needed someone, Claire continued. And family comes before titles. There was no self-pity in her voice. No dramatic emotion. Just truth. Simple and direct. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. The waitress he had judged the night before had not been serving tables because she lacked ambition. She had been balancing two worlds at once. Caring for family while quietly continuing consulting work through Harrison Group. The realization landed heavily, even heavier than the receipt. The partner concluded his remarks and signed off. Business resumed. Yet the room felt different now. The executives no longer saw Claire as a mysterious strategist. They saw her as someone who had willingly sacrificed prestige without sacrificing excellence. Someone who understood responsibility in a way many powerful people had forgotten. Ethan glanced toward the portfolio again. The folded receipt remained inside, unchanged, waiting. And as discussions continued around him, he began to understand that the greatest lesson of the day had nothing to do with investors, contracts, or negotiations. It was about the danger of mistaking someone's circumstances for their worth. By late morning, the crisis that had threatened to unravel Ethan Caldwell's company was no longer spiraling out of control. The revised strategy Claire Bennett had built was already producing results. Messages began arriving from investors who only hours earlier had been preparing to walk away. Meetings were rescheduled. Conversations reopened. Confidence returned one careful step at a time. Around the boardroom, executives looked relieved. Some even looked inspired. Claire accepted none of the praise. Each time someone congratulated her, she redirected attention back to the work. The company still had challenges ahead. There was still more to do. Success, in her view, was not a moment. It was a responsibility. Ethan watched all of it unfold with growing admiration and increasing discomfort. The more he learned about Claire, the worse his behavior from the previous night seemed. What troubled him most was not the note itself. It was the mindset behind it. He had looked at a uniform and assumed he understood an entire life. He had looked at a job and decided he knew a person's potential. The realization was humbling. Shortly before noon, the final investor call ended. The results exceeded expectations. 2 major partners agreed to return. A third requested immediate discussions. What had appeared impossible only hours earlier was suddenly achievable. Applause filled the room. Executives smiled. Hands were shaken. Some even laughed for the first time all day. Through it all, Claire remained calm. She closed her notebook and organized her documents with the same quiet focus she had shown from the beginning. No victory speech. No celebration. Just professionalism. As people slowly exited the boardroom, Ethan remained behind. This time, he did not wait for privacy to happen. He created it. Could everyone give us a few minutes? He asked. The room quickly emptied. Soon only Ethan and Claire remained. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows. The storm from the previous night was gone. The city below looked bright and full of possibility. Ethan took a slow breath. Claire, I owe you an apology. She looked at him quietly, but said nothing. Ethan continued. Not because you saved this deal. Not because of what you accomplished today. I owed you that apology before any of this happened. Claire listened. What I wrote was wrong, Ethan said. And more importantly, what I believed when I wrote it was wrong. The silence that followed felt honest. Uncomfortable, but honest. Claire reached into her portfolio and removed the folded receipt. She placed it on the table between them. Ethan looked at it. The paper seemed much heavier than it should have been. Do you know why I kept it? Claire asked softly. Ethan shook his head. Because moments like that are reminders. She glanced toward the city skyline. Not reminders that people can be cruel. We already know that. Reminders that every person we meet is carrying a story we cannot see. Ethan lowered his eyes. Claire could have embarrassed him. She could have exposed him in front of his executives. She could have used the moment to settle a score. Instead, she offered something far more powerful. Grace. And somehow that made the lesson impossible to forget. For the first time in many years, Ethan Caldwell felt genuinely small. Not because someone had defeated him, because someone had shown him a better standard than the one he had been living by. The conversation ended quietly, but its impact stayed with Ethan long after the words were spoken. Claire folded the receipt once more and returned it to her portfolio. There was no dramatic gesture, no final speech, just a simple act that somehow carried more weight than any business agreement signed that morning. A few minutes later, executives began returning to the boardroom to review the next phase of implementation. News of the recovered investor confidence had already started spreading through the company. Phones rang constantly. Assistants moved quickly through hallways. Schedules were rearranged. The crisis that had threatened to define the year was steadily becoming a success story. Yet the most remarkable transformation was happening inside Ethan himself. Throughout the afternoon, he watched Claire interact with everyone around her. She treated senior executives and administrative assistants exactly the same. She thanked reception staff by name. She listened carefully when junior analysts spoke. She gave credit freely and accepted praise reluctantly. The more Ethan observed, the more he understood why people trusted her. It had nothing to do with intelligence alone. Plenty of intelligent people existed in business. What made Claire different was character. Her confidence never required someone else to feel small. Around 3 o'clock, the final investor confirmation arrived. The largest partner officially recommitted to the project. Applause broke out across the conference room. Smiles appeared everywhere. One executive joked that Claire deserved her own corner office before sunset. Another suggested naming the recovery plan after her. Claire laughed softly and shook her head. "I think the company already has enough names attached to things," she said. The room laughed with her. Ethan smiled as well, but his attention drifted toward the old silver watch resting beneath the cuff of her sleeve. He remembered seeing it the previous night beneath restaurant lights. At the time, he had not thought twice about it. Now he realized how little he had truly noticed. Later, as the meeting finally concluded, people gathered their belongings and prepared to leave. Some had flights to catch. Others had families waiting at home. Claire closed her notebook and slipped it into her portfolio. Her work here was finished. Ethan approached her near the doorway. "Claire." She turned. "Yes." Ethan hesitated before speaking. "You could have embarrassed me today." Claire looked at him thoughtfully. "I could have. Why did you not?" For a moment, she seemed to consider the question carefully. Then she glanced toward the windows where sunlight reflected off neighboring skyscrapers. "Because humiliation rarely teaches the lesson people think it does," she said softly. "Respect teaches better." Ethan stood silent. Claire offered a small smile. "Besides, everyone gets something wrong eventually. The important part is what they do after they realize it." With that, she picked up her portfolio and headed toward the elevators. Ethan watched her leave. The doors closed. The elevator descended. And for the first time in years, success felt different to him. Not because his company had been saved. Not because investors had returned. But because one quiet woman had reminded him that titles impress people for a moment, while character stays with them for a lifetime. 1 year later, the rain returned to Manhattan. Not as a storm this time. Just a gentle evening shower that painted the city in reflections and soft light. The Alder room looked much the same as it had on that unforgettable night. The chandeliers still glowed. The jazz still drifted quietly through the dining room. The windows still framed the restless energy of New York beyond the glass. Some things had changed, however. Ethan Caldwell had changed. Success still surrounded him. His company had grown stronger than ever. The crisis that once threatened everything had become a case study taught in business schools across the country. Yet whenever reporters asked about the turning point, Ethan never talked about investors or negotiations. He talked about perspective. He talked about humility. He talked about the danger of believing that a title reveals a person's value. That evening, he requested a table near the same window where he had sat a year earlier. The staff recognized him immediately. Some remembered the story. Others only knew fragments of it. Ethan greeted everyone warmly. By now, he had become known for something entirely different than ruthless efficiency. He had become known for respect. A few minutes later, Claire Bennett entered the restaurant. She was not working that night. She had agreed to meet Ethan for coffee after finishing another consulting project. The old silver watch still rested on her wrist. Ethan smiled when he saw it. Claire smiled back. They sat across from one another as friends. Not because of wealth, not because of business, because mutual respect had quietly replaced assumptions. They spoke for nearly an hour. About family, about work, about the strange ways life teaches its lessons. Eventually, the server delivered the check. Ethan glanced at it and smiled softly. Claire immediately knew what he was thinking. Still carrying that receipt in your wallet? She asked. Ethan laughed. Every day. Claire shook her head, amused. I never expected that. Ethan looked toward the rain beyond the window. Neither did I. He picked up a pen. For a brief moment, the memory of that night returned. The frustration, the arrogance, the careless words. Then he lowered the pen and wrote a different message. When he finished, he folded the receipt and handed it to Claire. She opened it slowly. Beneath the total, a single sentence appeared in careful handwriting. Thank you for teaching me what success forgot. Claire read the words and remained silent for several seconds. Not because she was surprised, because she understood exactly what they meant. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, neither person felt the need to say anything more. Some lessons do not arrive through victory. Some arrive through embarrassment, honesty, and the courage to become better afterward. The truth is, we never really know the full story of the people standing in front of us. The quietest person in the room may be carrying extraordinary wisdom. The simplest uniform may hide remarkable strength. And sometimes the greatest measure of character is not how we treat powerful people, but how we treat those we believe can do nothing for us. If this story stayed with you, perhaps it is because all of us have been underestimated at some point, or maybe because all of us have underestimated someone else. Share your thoughts below, and if stories about dignity, kindness, and second chances speak to you, consider joining us again for another journey. Sometimes the quiet ones are never truly ordinary.